Good to see you guys. How's your last week? This is our last week in Uri. I guess it's not your last week if you're a student. You got like 2 weeks left and then finals. Is that right? Man, it's really winding down. But yeah, this is our last week in Uri Lecture Hall. We've been in here all year, and this is our last Sunday in here. So next, you're going to hear a little more about this, but next Sunday we'll be at Waypoint Church, just right off campus for baptisms and celebrations and some really fun stuff. And then we're meeting at Waypoint throughout the summer. So this will be our last Sunday in Uri, but we have loved Uri. It's really served us well this year, and we'll probably be back in the same space next week. We bought this pipe and drape that you noticed behind me. We bought it like 2 months ago, and it showed up yesterday. So we get to use it one time before the summer. Hopefully it makes a real difference. We'll see. Like Caleb and Courtney said, this week we're finishing up a sermon series that we've been in for the last 3 weeks called Beneath the Surface. We've been talking about emotional health. And for the last 2 weeks, we've been really focused on the emotional health of the individual. Okay, so week 1, we learned that the Bible teaches that our emotions are a good gift from God that have been twisted because of sin. They're a good gift that has been twisted, and therefore, our emotions can be wrong. And it is the Christian's duty to discipline and train those emotions back into alignment with the truth. That's what the process of emotional maturation means. That's what it looks like. And then last week, we got really practical about how to discipline our emotions. So we said there are 5 ways that God has given us to discipline our emotions. We said, ask the Spirit, search the Word, be in community, capture your thoughts, and cultivate your consumption. And using those 5 tools, we can slowly start to realign our emotions with the truth. Or another way to say that would be, we can learn to feel what God feels about a situation. Learn to feel what God feels. That's what emotional maturity is. So in the last 2 weeks, here's how we've defined emotional maturity. We said emotional maturity is when your emotional reality matches the reality that you are reacting to. Your emotional reality matches the reality that you are reacting. So the emotions you feel are appropriate to the context, appropriate to the situation that you are faced with. It's when your emotions are aligned with the truth. And that definition is going to be important for us here in a minute because we have a bit more defining to do today. So that's what the last 2 weeks have looked like. If you missed one of those weeks or you're curious about how we got to any of those conclusions, I'd really encourage you to jump on the YouTube page. And those sermons are up there, and they could be really helpful to you. But today, so 2 weeks on the individual's emotional health, today we're going to zoom out. Instead of focusing on the individual health, on the emotional health of the individual, we're going to be looking at the emotional health of a community. Now, this could be a friend group, a workplace, a neighborhood, an organization, a church, or a nation. It doesn't really matter what it is, but for our purposes here, as a church, I'm going to be talking specifically about an emotionally healthy church. So how do we define emotionally healthy community? I'm going to use that phrase a lot. So what do I mean by it when I say it? Or what does an emotionally mature community look like? Well, that's actually a fairly simple question, because a community is made up of individuals. So if a community is made up of individuals, then communal maturity has to be connected to individual maturity. Those can't be totally distinct concepts. So if emotional maturity is when your emotional reality matches the reality that you're reacting to, which is how we defined it the last 2 weeks, then an emotionally mature community is a community that promotes emotional maturity in its individuals. A community that spurs people on to their own individual emotional maturity. That's what an emotionally mature or healthy community would be. You've probably been in some healthy communities before that push its members toward truth and peace and clarity and reality. And then you've probably been in some unhealthy communities that push its members toward gossip or division or strife or lies. Right? You can probably think of an unhealthy sports team or a cliquey youth group or a volatile workplace. We have those experiences in our past, right? As you think back. So as Christians, it's our goal to work toward being emotionally mature individuals whose emotions align with reality. And as a church, as Resonate Church, it is our goal to work toward being an emotionally mature community that promotes emotional health in its individuals. That's why we're doing this whole sermon series, because we want to be an emotionally mature community. And this week, I want to talk about how we can do that. How we can do that. How to build an emotionally healthy community. So here's what I want to do today. Here's the structure for the rest of this time. I want to introduce a couple of concepts around how to build communal emotional health. And then we're going to open the Bible and take a look at the way that Jesus modeled these concepts in his life. That's kind of our structure for today. And what we're going to find is that Jesus was not only perfectly emotionally healthy as an individual, but Jesus created an environment of emotional maturity everywhere he went. He created a community of emotional maturity everywhere he went. So, two concepts I want to introduce you guys to kind of start out. The first one comes from a man named Murray Bowen. Murray Bowen. Here's a picture of Murray Bowen. Murray Bowen was an American psychiatrist. He was a professor at Georgetown University, and he was a physician at the National Institute of Mental Health. And Bowen specialized in community psychological dynamics. Community psychological dynamics. So how do groups and teams and organizations and especially families function together? I read multiple websites that said that Bowen is the Einstein of family therapy. Like he's the expert, he's the pinnacle in family therapy. And after 50 years of clinical work in family therapy, Bowen published his magnum opus, the big conclusion to his career, under the title Family Therapy in Clinical Practice. Family Therapy in Clinical Practice. And this was a huge book, like 600-something pages, and most of what Bowen wrote about in that book goes way beyond the scope of this sermon, certainly. But there's one particular concept that I think can be really helpful to us. That's what we're going to talk about today. Bowen introduced a concept that could classify social human functioning from the lowest possible levels, so like the ultimate social and emotional immaturity, up to the highest possible levels, the ultimate social and emotional maturity, on a single dimension. That was what was unique about Bowen's concept. It classified this stuff on a single dimension. And this concept was called differentiation of self. Differentiation of self. And here's how Bowen defined differentiation of self. Differentiation of self is the ability of a person to interact with his environment without taking on the anxiety of the environment. The ability of a person to interact with his environment without taking on the anxiety of the environment. So Bowen's scale is kind of shaped like a roof peak, kind of like a steep roof peak. And on the far left side, you have a 0. It goes 0 to 100. So on the far left side, you have a 0, which is completely undifferentiated. And then in the middle and at the top, you have a 100, which means perfectly differentiated. And then on the far right, you're back to a 0, which means overly differentiated. So here's a simplified version of Bowen's scale that we're just going to leave up on the screen for a while. So again, it's oversimplified, but this is basically the concept. Now, Bowen argues that people at a 0 are dominated by feelings and selfishness and subjectivity. They orient their life goals around things like love and happiness and comfort and personal success and security. But people at a 100 exhibit the perfect balance of autonomy on one hand and togetherness on the other hand. They're not dominated by the emotional fusion and the anxiety of the people on the left side of the scale, but they're also not cold and selfish like the people on the right side of the scale. The people toward the top of the scale tend to have very clear convictions and opinions. Very clear convictions and opinions, but they are still sensitive to the opinions of the others around them. They can see clearly the difference between their thoughts and their feelings, and they're guided by reality, not guided by their emotions. These people are way more impervious to both praise and criticism because they have a realistic picture of themselves in their mind. They clearly know who they are. Now, on the far ends, on the far right and left side, you'll notice two behaviors that exhibit extreme immaturity. Fusion on the left side and cutoff on the right side. These are really important concepts to Bowen because both fusion and cutoff basically prevent a community from being healthy. They're like poison in the water supply. If those things are present, the community cannot be healthy. So on the far left side, you have fusion or enmeshment. And what fusion is it's a condition in which two or more people are involved in each other's lives to an excessive degree, thus precluding healthy interaction and compromising individual autonomy. They're too involved to have healthy autonomy. So this is codependency. This is what happens when boundaries become unclear and permeable and they start to become dependent on one another. Now, this often happens in things like unhealthy dating relationships or friendships between two people that are both highly anxious, or sometimes I'll see this happen in discipleship relationships when the leader has this strong desire to be needed and the follower has a strong desire to be cared for. They develop kind of this codependent fusion type relationship. And then on the far right, you have cutoff. And cutoff is a condition in which people manage their unresolved emotional issues by reducing or eliminating emotional contact with the person. Resolve your issues or manage your unresolved issues by reducing or eliminating emotional contact. So this looks like separation or isolation or withdrawal or running away. That's what cutoff is. Now this often happens when someone has been emotionally hurt by someone else. And most often it happens with a family member. And then the response is you just decide to cut them off entirely. Now what's interesting about Bowen's scale is that it's not a line. It's not a flat horizontal line. Like I said, it's shaped like a really steep roof peak. It's kind of more like this type of a diagram. And the reason that it's shaped like that is because people don't just inhabit one side of the scale or the other. Okay, they're not just going to be on the left side or the right side. So it's not like this picture. It's not like somebody is a 30 on the left side. That's not how you would score in this kind of thing. Instead, someone inhabits both sides of the spectrum that correspond to their score. So it's way more like this. If you're a 30, you're 30 on the right and the left side. So they're not just 30 on the left side or on the right side, but on both sides at the same time. They're going to exhibit symptoms of being a 30 on both sides of the spectrum. So I know that's a little bit confusing. So here's an example that we're probably all somewhat familiar with. Let's say a young woman has a bad relationship with her father. Okay, let's say that he's kind of volatile or absent or uncaring or something like that, and they have a really hard time functioning together. And this young woman graduates high school and decides that the best way to deal with her toxic father is by cutting him off. Okay, so she moves out of the house and moves across the country to start a new life. So she's exhibiting symptoms of cutoff right there, managing your unresolved conflict by cutting those people off. So she's on the right side. But now she's moved into this new city and she has a deep longing for positive male attention because of the gap that her father left in her life. So she gets very quickly involved in a romantic relationship that becomes all-consuming. And she becomes enmeshed or fused to that boyfriend. So now she's also exhibiting symptoms of being on the far left side. So she has exhibited poor differentiation on both sides of the scale at the same time. That's how this would typically work. So when you see symptoms of poor differentiation on one side, there's almost always some piece of that person's life where they're exhibiting the symptoms of the other side in their life. So Bowen gives us the concept of differentiation of self, and then he gives us a warning about the two extremes, cutoff and fusion. Now, that's our first concept for today. Now, our second concept comes from a man named Edwin Friedman. Friedman was born in 1932 in New York City. He was an ordained rabbi, a family therapist, and a leadership consultant. Friedman was also an avid disciple of Murray Bowen and his concept of the family systems theory. Late in his life, Friedman began writing a book, but he actually died before it was published. So some editors and kind of co-workers around him used his essays and journal entries to finish the book. And in 2007, they published A Failure of Nerve by Edwin Friedman. Some of you guys have probably read Failure of Nerve. In Failure of Nerve, Friedman took Bowen's concept of the differentiation of self and he applied it to leadership. And Friedman argued that good leadership is not about intelligence, it's not about self-confidence or sociability or technique or skill or any of that stuff. Instead, Friedman says the primary characteristic of a good leader is self-differentiation. Self-differentiation is the primary characteristic of a good leader. So he provides an even simpler definition than Bowen. Friedman says self-differentiation is knowing where one ends and another begins. Knowing where I end and another begins. Friedman uses an example of cellular biology kind of throughout his whole book. So think of a heart cell. That cell, the muscle cell in your heart, it has a nucleus which tells it what to do. It has mitochondria that provide power to the cell, and it has a cell membrane that differentiates it from other cells, separates it from other cells. Now your heart, the organ of your heart, is made up of lots of different kinds of cells. You have muscle cells and blood cells and nerve cells and all of that stuff. And all of those cells are differentiated. They each do what they are made to do, and they are unaffected by the other cells around them. They don't rub off. They don't accept peer pressure from the other cells around them. So a heart cell knows that its job is to pump blood. A nerve cell's job is to carry electrical impulses. A blood cell's job is to carry oxygen to the body. So if a muscle cell's sitting there pumping away, and a blood cell floated by and said, "What are you doing? Are you dumb? Why don't you come carry oxygen with me?" The muscle cell would be totally unaffected. It wouldn't be bothered at all by that because it knows its purpose. It is differentiated, so it knows that it has a purpose. The heart cell knows where it ends and another cell begins. So it doesn't accept that kind of peer pressure. Now, humans function just like cells. We organize ourselves into groups, like families or companies or churches or nations, just like cells organize themselves into organs and body parts and bodies. A well-differentiated person can stay connected to the other members of the group without losing his identity in the group and without taking on the anxiety of the group. Okay? A well-differentiated person is connected to the group without losing their identity or taking on the anxiety of the group. So remember Bowen's definition of differentiation of self. He said the ability of a person to interact with an environment without taking on the anxiety of the environment. So Friedman is just saying exactly what Bowen was just saying. A well-differentiated person can take a defined stand even when other people disagree and still remain connected relationally to the group. So they can take a stand that nobody else agrees with without cutting off relationships. They can stay relationally connected. This means they don't give in to fusion on one hand, and they don't give in to cutoff. They don't go to those extremes. To go back to our cellular biology example, a poorly differentiated person is way more like a virus. They don't have a nucleus, which is their organizing principle or their convictions or their individual purpose. So they can't exist on their own. They can't operate on their own. Instead, they need to look for other poorly differentiated cells that they can latch onto. That's how a virus acts. Now in people, this often looks like gossip and codependency and emotional neediness. These poorly differentiated people can't handle conflict maturely, so whenever something comes up, whenever they have an issue with someone, they have to rope in a third person. And this is what Friedman calls triangling. This is an important term for him. He says to be triangled is to be brought into someone else's relational conflict or drama. Be brought into somebody else's relational conflict or drama. I'm positive you're familiar with triangling, right? Two of your friends have beef with each other. They want to talk to you about it to get you on their side of the issue. It happens to us all the time. We've all been triangled a million times. That is what triangling looks like. And it often feels flattering or like exciting to be involved in the drama, but Friedman actually says that the chief cause, this is an important quote, the chief cause of stress and burnout is not overworking, which is what everybody thinks, but getting stuck in other people's problems. The chief reason that you're stressed and burnt out is not because you're working too hard, it's because you're getting stuck in other people's problems. So I bet if you thought back to a time in your life where you just felt exhausted and you traced what was going on relationally, I bet you would find that you were pretty stuck in some other people's problems. You were getting triangled frequently. I know that's been true when I think back about my life. Well-differentiated people refuse to be triangled. That they refuse to get in the middle of drama because getting triangled only increases the amount of anxiety in the community. It's only raising the level of emotional unhealth. Okay? So far, we're probably all on board, right? You guys are thinking, I like this Bowen guy, he's pretty smart, or the Friedman guy, he's pretty smart. I like what he's saying here, right? Is that kind of the vibe so far? Well, allow me to throw a wrench in your perspective of Edwin Friedman, if I may. Because Friedman makes one claim that would basically get you crucified in today's culture. But I actually think that it may be a hidden secret that many of us are missing. So as soon as you hear this, I just want you to know, you're going to bristle up. You're going to have kind of a defensive reaction when you hear what Friedman says. So this is an opportunity to practice our emotional maturity. Right? We can control our emotions. We don't have to shut down. We can consider a perspective that maybe we haven't considered before. Okay? So let's do it. Let's take a deep breath. You ready? Ready for it? Here it is. Friedman says that empathy is the most common form of triangling. Empathy is the most common form of triangling. Now, before we burn all of his books, we got to allow Friedman to explain what he's saying. Friedman says that an emphasis on empathy is used as a power tool by the weak and immature to sabotage strong leaders and to avoid personal responsibility and growth. Okay? Empathy is a power tool used by the weak and immature to sabotage leaders and avoid personal responsibility and growth. So here's a quote from him. Friedman writes, It has generally been my experience that in any community or family discussion, those who are the first to introduce concern for empathy feel powerless and are trying to use the togetherness force of a regressed society, an immature community is what that means. The togetherness force of a regressed society to get those they perceive to have power to adapt to them. They're trying to get the leader, whoever has the power, to adapt to them. I have consistently found the introduction of the subject of empathy into family, institutional, and community meetings to be reflective of, as well as an effort to induce, a failure of nerve in its leadership. So he would say, when empathy comes up in a community, it is both a result of a failure of nerve in the leadership, and it causes a failure of nerve in the leadership. So here's what Friedman's saying. In order for a community to be emotionally healthy, each member must take personal responsibility for their own differentiation. Okay? Everybody has to take personal responsibility. Empathy, as it is typically applied, pushes pause on all personal responsibility so that we can sit in the dysfunction. That's how empathy is often used in Friedman's view. It pushes pause on all forward motion, all personal responsibility, so that we can just sit in the dysfunction. So from Friedman's perspective, whenever emotionally immature people want to avoid personal responsibility, they pull the empathy card. That's how he viewed empathy. You see what I mean by an unpopular opinion? Wouldn't get along very well in our day. Now, I want to make sure you hear me say this really clear. I don't want to be getting emails about things I didn't say. Don't hear me say that there's no place for compassion or assistance. God commands Christians to be compassionate and to help people in need. So I want to make sure you hear me say that just really clearly. We absolutely should be kind and gentle and compassionate, especially to people that are in hard situations. That is absolutely true. But that is not how our general culture uses the term empathy. That's not what empathy means. Empathy is typically defined as the ability to share someone else's feelings. The ability to share someone else's feelings. I got that from Cambridge English Dictionary. I didn't make up that definition. The ability to share someone else's feelings. So take that definition, keep it in your mind for a second, and now think of the Christian view of emotions from 2 weeks ago, where we concluded that emotions are a good gift, but they can be wrong or inappropriate or sinful, depending on their alignment with reality. So if Christians believe that human emotions can be wrong as part of our fallen nature, and if empathizing is sharing someone else's feelings, period, then it is obvious that Christians cannot empathize. But before we can share someone else's feelings, we must first make sure that those feelings are aligned with the truth. Otherwise, we're just joining them in their sin. It would be just like if somebody said a Christian must join someone in their actions. That doesn't make any sense, right? We would first have to know if they are good actions or bad actions before we can say you have to join them in the actions. So if you're stuck in ditch number 1 from a few weeks ago, if you're still believing that emotions cannot be wrong, then empathy totally makes sense. Like, I get it. That's why our culture is obsessed with empathy, because they're stuck in ditch number 1 and they think emotions cannot be wrong. But if you hold to a Christian view of emotions that believes that emotions can be wrong or inappropriate or sinful, then you cannot empathize because it demands that you join someone in their sin. So if only we had a common, ancient, biblical word that meant something like to care about someone's feelings while remaining attached to reality, right? If only we had a word like that, then it would be the perfect word to use. I have good news for you. We do have a word like that. That word is sympathize. Okay? That word's been around for thousands of years. Sympathize. That's exactly what sympathize means. Okay? That's my aside on empathy. I know some of you guys you're bristled up right now. Your blood is boiling a little bit. That's okay. How could he say that empathy is wrong? Please come to the Q&A afterwards. Let's talk out the nuances. That's going to be a great place to get to talk through the details together. But Friedman, to get back to Friedman, claimed that a well-differentiated leader, if he wants to see his followers grow in emotional maturity, must focus on responsibility rather than empathy. Responsibility rather than empathy. That's how a leader creates emotional maturity in his people. So back to the biology example. A well-differentiated person is like the emotional immune system. But by being well-differentiated, by being a non-anxious presence that refuses to be triangled, and refuses to be halted by a call to empathy, he just doesn't let people push pause on all progress, the differentiated person forces others to take responsibility for themselves. Forces people to take responsibility for themselves. Friedman writes, a calm and settled integrity stops the invaders from sickening or even killing the organization. The invaders are the virus, the poorly differentiated people. Many leadership battles can be won simply by not giving up, staying true to one's sense of calling, staying in touch with reactive people without becoming reactive yourself, and finding ways to require reactive people to take personal responsibility for the chaos in their own lives. And over time, this decreases the amount of anxiety and issues in the community. Over time, pay attention, I said over time, it decreases the anxiety in the community. Friedman actually says that a leader's non-anxious response to anxiety, so when a leader is faced with anxiety, his or her non-anxious response is, this is a quote, the keys to the kingdom of effective leadership. So he says it's not about intelligence or sociability or skill or anything like that. It's about not responding to anxiety with more anxiety. That's it. That's the whole key to leadership. So these principles can be applied anywhere, to anyone at any level of leadership, whether you're a parent or a spouse or a village leader or a pastor or a boss or the president of the United States. You can apply this anywhere. Even if you're the only person you're leading, you can still apply it to yourself. All of us are leaders in some way. So don't make the mistake of thinking, I'm not a leader, so this doesn't matter to me. So with those two resources underneath us, let me summarize what we've covered so far. We said that individual emotional maturity is when your emotional reality matches the reality you're reacting to, right? We covered that. And then we said an emotionally mature community is a community that promotes emotional maturity in its individuals. But what does it look like to be emotionally mature in a community? Okay, how do we bridge the gap between a bunch of emotionally mature individuals and an emotionally mature community? How do we all come together to try to build an emotionally mature community together? Well, according to Bowen and Friedman, emotional maturity in a community looks like self-differentiation. That is the key. It looks like self-differentiation, knowing where one ends and another begins. Okay, now you might be wondering what this looks like practically. I'm going to try to get practical toward the end, and then we'll get really practical in the Q&A afterwards that I encourage you to stick around for. But first, we need to test this definition that I just said. Emotional maturity in community looks like self-differentiation. We need to test that definition with Scripture to see if it lines up. Bowen and Friedman are experts. They're geniuses. They might be expert psychologists, but the Bible is our authority. So before we can take anything that Bowen and Friedman say and talk of it authoritatively, we need to see if it's compatible with Scripture. And if it's not, we throw it out. We get rid of all of it. So what I want to do is take a brief look at the life of Jesus, the perfect man. Because if anybody's going to be a 100 on Bowen's scale, it would be Jesus. And what we're going to find here is that when we start looking at Jesus, he truly was perfectly differentiated, individually and communally. He maintained the perfect balance of emotional integration on one hand and emotional differentiation on the other hand. Jesus was perfectly balanced. So let me prove it to you. Matthew, Mark, and John don't tell us much of anything about Jesus from ages 1 to 30. But in Luke, there's a story about Jesus when he's 12 years old. So here's what we read in Luke 2. It says, now his parents went to Jerusalem every year at the feast of the Passover. And when he was 12 years old, they went up according to custom. And when the feast was ended, as they were returning, the boy Jesus stayed behind in Jerusalem. His parents did not know it, but supposing him to be in the group, they went a day's journey. But then they began to search for him among their relatives and acquaintances. And when they did not find him, they returned to Jerusalem searching for him. After 3 days, they found him in the temple, sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions. And all who heard him were amazed at his understanding and his answers. And when his parents saw him, they were astonished. And his mother said to him, son, why have you treated us so? Behold, your father and I have been searching for you in great distress. So Jesus, he's 12 years old. He's faced with a highly anxious situation. Imagine your mom's been looking for you for 3 days and she finds you. Highly anxious situation. Now watch how Jesus responds. Watch his non-anxious response. Verse 49. And he said to them, why were you looking for me? Did you not know that I must be in my Father's house? And they did not understand the saying that he spoke to them. And he went down with them and came to Nazareth and was submissive to them. And his mother treasured up all these things in her heart. And Jesus increased in wisdom and in stature and in favor with God and man. So even at 12 years old, Jesus is differentiated enough to take an I position. He makes an I claim. I must be at my Father's house. So at 12, Jesus is already displaying that he can see himself as a differentiated person with his own goals, his own purpose, his own beliefs. But at the same time, he willingly submits to his parents and he comes home. He doesn't just say, I'm staying in the temple forever. He comes home. He doesn't cut them off. He doesn't isolate, but he's not fused together with them either. Jesus is displaying differentiation. Now, 18 years later, when he's 30 years old, Jesus begins his public ministry. And the first thing that he does is he goes into the wilderness to fast and to be tempted by the devil. For 40 days, he doesn't eat. And at the end, he's starving, and the devil comes to him. Here's what it says in Luke 4. The devil said to him, "If you are the Son of God, command this stone to become bread." And Jesus answered him, "It is written, man shall not live by bread alone." And the devil took him up and showed him all the kingdoms of the world in a moment of time, and said to him, "To you I will give all this authority and their glory, for it has been delivered to me, and I give it to whom I will. If you then will worship me, it will all be yours." And Jesus answered him, "It is written, you shall worship the Lord your God, and him only shall you serve." And he took him to Jerusalem and set him on the pinnacle of the temple and said to him, "If you are the Son of God, throw yourself down from here. For it is written, he will command his angels concerning you, to guard you, and on their hands they will bear you up, lest you strike your foot against the stone." And Jesus answered him, "It is said, you shall not put the Lord your God to the test." And when the devil had ended every temptation, he departed from him until an opportune time. So 3 times, Satan tempts Jesus to deny his convictions, to give in to what would be easy and comfortable. And 3 times, Jesus stands firmly on his convictions. He doesn't give in. He has a clear sense of self, so he doesn't deviate. When Satan says, if you're the Son of God, that doesn't insult Jesus because he knows who he is. He has a clear sense of self. Now this pattern, if you start opening the Gospels, you're going to see this pattern repeats itself over and over again. In Mark chapter 4, Jesus and the disciples are in a boat, and it gets stormy out. The waves are coming in. The disciples are terrified, and Jesus is asleep on a cushion. And the disciples, they're freaking out. They grab Jesus. They say, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" Now, empathy would tell us that what Jesus really needs to do is just meet them where they're at. Right? Empathy would say, "Hey, guys, I know how you feel. I'm really sorry that you're scared. I'm scared too. I'm just really here with you." That's the empathy response. But is that what Jesus does? No, he stands up, he turns to the storm, he says, "Be still." Then he turns back to the disciples and he says, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" That's Jesus' response. He doesn't pick up the anxiety of his surroundings. He remains differentiated. Everybody else is freaking out, and Jesus is calm enough to be asleep, evidently. There are some of us that, we might think that Jesus' response is cold or uncompassionate in that moment. But what Jesus is doing is he's actually being a good leader. Because Jesus knows that his disciples will soon need to be able to endure much worse than a storm. So they need to learn to withstand the difficulty as self-differentiated people. That's what Jesus is forcing them to be. He's being a good leader. In Luke chapter 10, a little bit later, Jesus comes into town, and a woman named Martha welcomes him into her house. And Martha has a sister named Mary, and Mary sat down at Jesus' feet, and she's just listening to him. And Martha's in the kitchen, she's making him food, she's all busy serving him. And at one point, Martha tries to triangle Jesus. She says, "Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me to serve alone? Tell her then to help me." Martha's trying to triangle him, trying to drag Jesus into her unresolved conflict. Now, what does Jesus do? Again, the empathy response would say, "Hey, Martha, I know what you mean. I'm sorry Mary isn't helping with the chores. I get it. I'm here with you." Is that what Jesus does? No, he says, "Martha, Martha, you are anxious about many things, but only one thing is necessary, and Mary has chosen the good portion." Martha tries to triangle Jesus, and he refuses to be triangled. Jesus remains differentiated. He won't be triangled. He's not going to take on her anxiety, and he's not going to pretend that Martha's anxiety is okay. He doesn't pretend like that's all okay. Again, Jesus is the ultimate differentiated leader. We could keep going, situation after situation. In Matthew 9, the Pharisees pressure Jesus to conform to Jewish religious practices. Jesus flatly refuses, based on his own convictions. In Luke 4, when the crowds pressure him to stay with them, he refuses because he knows that he has a mission to accomplish. In Luke 7, when the disciples pressure him to reveal his identity as the Messiah, Jesus turns the question back on them because he knows it was not time for that to be revealed yet. Over and over and over again, Jesus knows where he ends and another begins. Jesus calls people to take responsibility for their own issues, and Jesus refuses to take on the anxiety of his environment. In fact, as you read the Gospels, you almost get this distinct sense of Jesus seems incapable of being driven to an anxious response. You can't make him anxious. Jesus exhibits lots of emotions, right? Positive and negative emotions all over the place, and those are good emotions, but you cannot drive Jesus to an anxious response. Search the Gospels for it. It just doesn't exist. He doesn't pick up anxiety from the environment around him. When we look at the life of Jesus, we can conclude that self-differentiation is indeed the defining factor of his leadership. The concept presented by Bowen and Friedman are correct. They're illustrated and proven by Jesus, but these are not Bowen and Friedman's concepts. This is Jesus' concept. All that Bowen and Friedman did is gave a psychological name to Jesus' leadership style. This is how he leads us. So, here's our big anticlimactic conclusion. This is a Sunday school answer. You're going to love it. If we want to create an emotionally mature community, we must work to be like Jesus. That's your answer. Self-differentiated. If we want to create an emotionally mature community, be like Jesus. Be self-differentiated. Now, as I move toward the close, let me try to get a little bit more practical. What does it look like, practically, for someone to be self-differentiated in community? I want to give you guys something that you can go home tonight and practice or engage with. Maybe the best simple way to describe it is you must balance emotional integration with emotional differentiation. Okay? Balance emotional integration with emotional differentiation. Too much emotional integration leads to fusion. Too much emotional differentiation leads to cutoff. You have to balance these two, just like Jesus did. So here's an illustration that might be helpful. It's been helpful for me. Imagine you and a friend are walking through the woods. I don't know where on earth these woods are, but your friend falls into a pit of quicksand. I don't know where quicksand is. But you're walking there and your friend falls into a pit of quicksand. Now, right away, you have a few options. You basically got 3 options in front of you. You could jump into the quicksand with both feet with them. That's an option you have. Okay? You also could run away to the nearest tree and cling on with both arms and make sure you don't touch the quicksand. Don't even get close. Or, your third option, you could grab onto a tree branch with one hand and reach out to your friend to save them with the other hand. Reach out to your friend to help them. Now, the quicksand in that illustration could be any tough life situation. It really doesn't matter what it is. Maybe it's a unhealthy romantic relationship, or a difficult work environment, or a conflict between friends, or a tough emotional bind, or tough financial bind. Really, any situation that causes anxiety in the life of your friend is the quicksand pit. Okay? Now, on one side, empathy requires that you share their emotions and their anxiety. You share in someone else's feelings. So empathy means to suffer in. That's where the word empathy means. Etymologically, pathy means feelings, or suffering, means in. So empathy means to suffer in someone. Empathy requires that you jump into the quicksand with both feet so that you two can really relate. You got to really get in there with them. Now that route leads to fusion or enmeshment. Now on the far opposite side, cutoff says that you just do whatever's best for you with no regard for the other person. So cutoff says you cling to that tree and you don't go near the quicksand, and you worry about you let them struggle on their own. Those are the extremes. But self-differentiation says that you can be relationally connected to them in their situation without taking on the anxiety of the situation. You don't have to get in the quicksand to help them out of the quicksand. Self-differentiation is grabbing the tree branch with one hand and reaching down to them with the other. It's keeping one foot on the solid ground of reality while reaching the other foot into their anxious situation to help them out. So let me think of a real world I had a few real world examples, but I don't have time for them. So one real world example, something you guys are probably familiar with. Let's say your roommate comes home super emotional because she heard her boss saying something mean about her behind her back. Okay, that's the context. Now, a fusion or an empathy response would be, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry, what a jerk. You shouldn't have to go through that. Like, you should just quit your job. That's the empathy response. The cutoff response sees your roommate getting out of her car crying, and you go, oh, there's Sally being a crybaby again. I'll make sure and not talk to her today. That's the cutoff response. The well-differentiated, the self-differentiation response would be to say, hey, thank you for telling me. I can imagine that would be a really difficult situation if that is indeed what happened. Do you mind if I ask you a couple questions? Like, how do you know your boss was talking about you? And is what your boss was saying true? And what can you do to maybe change his perspective on you? Can I ask some of those questions? The differentiated reaction connects with the person relationally. You're not being a jerk, you're not pushing them away, but they keep one foot on the ground of reality. They keep one foot in reality. They ask questions to try to figure out the truth. How do you even know he was talking about you? Maybe he was talking about somebody else. Right? They push the person to take personal responsibility. What can you do to change his perspective of you? They don't latch on to the anxiety of the situation by diving in the quicksand with them. Now, I want to give you a warning. If you leave church tonight and you commit to being a self-differentiated person from here on out, I'm going to do this. I'm going to do it every chance I get. Here's what you're going to run into tomorrow. I want to tell you what life's going to look like for you for a little bit. Someone's going to come to you with a problem, a situation that they're anxious about, and you're going to remember this sermon, and you're going to attempt to meet them in their emotions, but you're going to try to keep one foot in reality. You're going to try to keep yourself grounded in reality. You might try asking some questions. You might probe a little bit deeper. You might encourage them to take personal responsibility. And here's what's going to happen to you. They are going to get mad at you. Guarantee it. They're going to get mad at you. They're going to say, why can't you just listen? Right? Why don't you just believe me? Why are you making this into my fault? Why are you acting like you know better than me? Some of you married people are smiling because you know that's exactly how it goes. There's a pastor named Joe Rigney. He wrote an article at Desiring God. I linked it on the bottom of your handout. You should read it. If you're skeptical about all the talk on empathy, you should read that article. But here's what Rigney writes. One paragraph. He says, when humans are suffering, they tend to make two demands that are impossible to fulfill simultaneously. On the one hand, they want people to notice the depth of their pain and sorrow, how deep they are in the pit, how unique and tragic their circumstances. At the same time, they don't want to be made to feel that they really need the assistance of others. In one breath, they say, help me, can't you see I'm suffering? And in the next, they say, how dare you act as though I needed you and your help? The sufferer doesn't want to be alone and demands not to be pitied. This makes their emotional turmoil in suffering highly combustible and unpredictable. Now, when you leave church tonight and you try to be self-differentiated and someone gets mad at you for it, which will happen to you if you try this, that is when your self-differentiation is really put to the test. That's when you're put to the test. You can cave in to their anxious pressure, or you can stand firm in your self-differentiation. So they will be caught in the quicksand. And as soon as you grab the tree branch and start reaching out, they're going to say, if you really loved me, you would get in the quicksand with me. And in that moment, you have an opportunity to either cave in and get in the quicksand or to stand your ground. And it's way easier to cave in. It's way easier because it gets you out of the conflict right away. But it only adds anxiety to the system. It only makes the environment less emotionally mature and less emotionally healthy. But when you stand firm and you deal with the difficulty, and then you do it again and again and again and again, slowly, that will diffuse the anxiety from the system. And it will help the person become differentiated themselves. You will help them learn to take responsibility for their own issues, like Friedman said. And when enough of us commit to this kind of maturity and leadership, I believe we will gradually see our community become more and more emotionally healthy. And when God's church is the most emotionally healthy community in our city, people will be drawn to the power of Jesus that makes it possible. We get to be a witness. We in this room as a community get to be a witness to the world by our emotional health. People are going to wonder how that can be possible, and we get to point them to Jesus. So my prayer for all of us today and over this whole sermon series is that we commit to grow in our self-differentiation. It's not going to happen tonight. It's not going to happen overnight. This is a lifetime, and we're never perfect. Nobody's a 100 except for Jesus. Nobody's ever getting there perfectly. But I believe that if we commit to this together, we will see this community become more and more different from the rest of the world. And Jesus will be glorified through it. So I'm going to pray for us. I'm going to pray to that end and ask that you pray with me. And then we have kind of an activity and discussion right after this. So would you pray with me? Lord, we thank you for this evening, for a chance to meet on campus here throughout this whole year. God, we thank you for the blessing of Erie Lecture Hall that has allowed us to worship and learn and be in fellowship together throughout this whole year. God, thank you for this sermon series. I really pray that we will have learned something, that we would look different because of it, that your word would have illuminated some truths about things that can be really difficult or sensitive in our world today. And God, with the content from this week, I pray that we would take Jesus' leadership style and implement it personally. Would we not cave in to either of the extremes, to fusion or to cutoff, but would we be well differentiated, knowing who we are and our purpose and what you made us to do, refusing to take on the anxiety of the environment. And God, would that propel us as a community, as a church, into emotional health? Would we just look different than the rest of the world in a way that makes people look at us from the outside and say, what is different about that group? How can that be possible? And give us lots of opportunities to glorify you and magnify you when that happens. So God, we love you. We pray all this in your Son's name. Amen.